It's a great pleasure to introduce Ken Pollack, our guest speaker today. Ken is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, where he focuses on all aspects of the Middle East and particularly the Persian Gulf countries. He has a more than impressive bio, and for those of us with fairly decent intermediate term memories, you may recall he addressed the Chappaqua group back in 2014, 9 years ago. Ken began his career as a military analyst with the CIA, focusing on Iran and Iraq, and then served twice on the National Security Council, the second time as Director of Persian Gulf Affairs. He joined the Council on Foreign Relations in 2001 as a senior fellow, and then played the same role for a more lengthy period at the Brookings Institution, where he headed up the Sabin Center for Middle East Policy. As his career evolved, Ken somehow found the time to author 10 books on the Middle East. Among them was Unthinkable: Iran, the Bomb, and American Strategy, named by both The Economist and the New York Times as one of the best books of the year in 2013. And I shouldn't forget to mention, he's also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University and an advisor to both the Gerson-Lehrman Group and the Institute for the Analysis of Global Security. Well, the timing of today's talk could hardly be better, given the recent surprising agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia to reestablish relations, brokered by, of all countries, China. So to put it mildly, Ken, as you know only too well, there's a lot going on in your neck of the woods. So welcome, thanks for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you so much, Tyler. Thank you, June. Thank you, Joan. It's wonderful to be with all of you once again. And for those of you who are going to be watching this at some future time or future date, please understand that it is the morning of March the 27th, and all of you have access to information that I don't right now. So please don't hold me responsible for things that may happen 10 minutes later. Because as Tyler has pointed out, the events are moving extremely quickly all across the Middle East. And what I thought I would do is I wanted to give you all a bit of a context, a bit of a framework to understand some of the things going on, and then to kind of bring it up to the current day, current minute even, and to understand where the region may head into the future, and at least speculate a little bit on some of the trends that we may see playing out into the future. I'm tempted, whenever I try to explain what's going on in the Middle East, I'm of course tempted to kind of go back to the 7th century. And it is Ramadan, so perhaps we should say something about the Prophet Muhammad and the birth of Islam. But obviously we don't have time to go through all of that history, relevant though it may be. And so instead, where I want to start is the last 12, 14 years of American policy. Because the truth is that so much of what's going on in the Middle East right now is actually a reaction to the United States. I know that this is a series in particular about how the events of the world are affecting the United States, but obviously it's also about how the United States is affecting the rest of the world. And with the Middle East, right now, the prime mover behind the scenes really is the United States and what we're doing. And what I mean by that is that over the last 3 presidential administrations, the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and now the Biden administration, the United States has been gradually disengaging from the Middle East. This is huge. Right? This is the most important thing that's been going on in the Middle East. It is a seismic shift. We've not seen anything like this in 40 years, and all the states of the region are trying to accommodate themselves to it. And so much of what's going on in the Middle East right now is a response to this gradual disengagement. President Obama, when he came to office, obviously he hated the Iraq War, hated the Middle East, believed that the United States had, in his own words, overinvested in the Middle East, just wanted to get out. Famously tried to open up to Iran, our great adversary in the region, often at the expense of our various allies including the Saudis and the Israelis and the Emiratis and other countries, all of whom felt badly mistreated by the Obama administration, felt badly left behind by the United States, which of course had been its primary security partner, its primary security guarantor for the prior 40 years, or if you want to go back even further, past 70 years. So they were badly caught off guard by this change in American policy, didn't like the nuclear deal with Iran that Obama signed, felt that it very much left them in the lurch, didn't like a lot of what Obama said and did, and in particular didn't do. And it didn't get better under Donald Trump. If you read the New York Times, if you read most of the main newspapers, they seem to believe that Trump had this love affair with the Gulf. What I will tell you is that that's not what you hear from the Gulf states at all. They felt that Donald Trump was all talk and no action. He said a lot of stuff, he came for meetings, but in the crunch, he did nothing for our Middle Eastern allies, particularly the Arab allies in the Gulf. Some of you may remember that in 2019, the Iranians started attacking the oil exports of Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. In May and June, they went after a series of Saudi and Emirati oil tankers. And then when the United States did nothing, and in particular, when Trump announced that the US, literally, these were almost exactly his words, couldn't care less about what the Iranians did in the Middle East, right? The Iranians decided to escalate, and they attacked the massive Saudi oil facility at Abqaiq in September of 2019. And again, the United States did nothing. And it's important to understand just how terrifying that was for all of our allies in the region, including the Israelis, by the way. Right? This had been a foundational aspect of Middle Eastern security, of Middle Eastern international relations. It was the core of their security, as I said, for 40 or 70 years, depending on when you want to start to date it. Right? Many, I think, have probably heard of or aware of or remember the Carter Doctrine, which Jimmy Carter announced in January of 1980 that the United States would use force to protect Persian Gulf oil exports. Right? That had been the bedrock element of the US-Saudi relationship, the US relationship with the Gulf. And again, even the Israelis saw that as a very important stabilizing element in the Middle East. And here was Donald Trump walking away from it. I assume that Donald Trump had never even heard of the Carter Doctrine, just tore it up without even knowing he was doing so. But this was enormous for the states of the region. And when President Biden came to office, there was certainly some hope on their part. They knew that Joe Biden was much more of a centrist Democrat. They didn't like either Obama and Trump. They saw Obama as representing the kind of far left of the United States. They saw Trump as the MAGA right. They were hoping that with a new centrist Democrat, more of an internationalist, the US would kind of go back to its older policies of the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s. And I certainly think that Biden, that's still where he is in his heart. But a couple of other issues have arisen. First, obviously, the pandemic, the problems in the American economy, all of the other issues at home, these have swamped Joe Biden's agenda, right? He really doesn't have the bandwidth to do a whole lot on foreign policy. And to the extent he is, well, it's being completely taken up by the war in Ukraine and China and all of these other things. He just hasn't had a lot of time or energy or political capital to spend on the Middle East. And of course, beyond that, Joe Biden is also dealing again with the left wing of the Democratic Party, which under Obama and still to this day has more or less decided that the Saudis are somehow worse than the Iranians and wants absolutely nothing to do with them. And far be it from me to defend Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, or the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, right? But there's a bigger relationship there. And again, what the Saudis see is that President Biden doesn't seem to be willing to get past those incidents and reconnect with the larger US-Saudi, US-Gulf relationship. And so what they've seen over this period of 12 or 14 years has been the United States slowly pulling away from the Middle East, no longer interested in getting involved in the problems of the Middle East, no longer willing to guarantee their security in a way that we did in the past. Now, on the other side of the Gulf, an important element, what we're also been seeing in the last few years is during the same period of time, of course, as the US has pulled back, it's created a vacuum. Right? We were the hegemon of the Middle East. We were the great power of the Middle East. And as we have disengaged, it has opened up space that didn't exist beforehand. As I said, it's opened up a security vacuum. And of course, inevitably, what is rushed to fill that vacuum are all the worst things in the world. The terrorists, the vandals and oppositions, all kinds, all of them led ultimately by the government of Iran. The government of Iran is the ultimate anti-status quo power. It is seeking to overturn the entire regional order, to do it by force, however it possibly can. And Iran has benefited enormously from the disengagement of the United States. And before he was killed by President Trump, I should acknowledge that. Qasem Soleimani, Iran's great general, is the commander of their Quds force within the Revolutionary Guard, an absolutely brilliant man. He famously boasted that Iran controlled 4 Arab capitals: Beirut, Damascus, Baghdad, and Sana'a. And of course, his point was these are enormous gains that Iran had made even at that point in time, and they were going after more. They were looking for the next one and the next one and the next one. And of course, this too was deeply frightening to all of our allies: the Israelis, the Iranians, sorry, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Kuwaitis, the Jordanians, the Moroccans, the Egyptians, you name it. We're all terrified to see these gains that the Iranians were making. Now, what happened in the last couple of years, in particular, after Joe Biden came into office, and for the first 6 or 12 months, all of our allies in the region more or less gave him an opportunity to see if he really would reassert America's role in the Middle East. And they've all come to the conclusion that he's not going to. He's not going to, either because he doesn't have the ability, because of all the other political issues he faces, or because he doesn't like our allies the way that Obama didn't, or that he simply doesn't have the political clout within his own party because of where the left wing of the Democratic Party is moving. And so they've all come to the conclusion that they're not going to be able to get that American protector back. And this has caused a massive debate among all of our allies. And when I'm over there, I see it, I hear it, I'm part of it. The Israelis are having this debate. The Emiratis are having this debate. The Saudis are having this debate. The Kuwaitis, the Jordanians, you name it. They're all trying to figure out, what do we do now? How do we address our security needs in the present and the future without the United States, the country that we have been banking on for all of these years? And the truth of the matter is they don't have an answer yet. And they are casting about for how to solve this equation. And they have all kinds of different answers. And what we've been seeing in the region over the last 2 or 3 years is them trying to come up with these different answers. So one of the answers that both the Israelis and our Arab allies have come up with is, well, maybe they need to band together, right? This is where the Abraham Accords came from. And let's recognize the Abraham Accords were not the product of the Trump administration. The Trump administration brokered the deal, but it was a deal that both sides wanted to have and had been working on for at least a decade beforehand. And it was all about the threat from Iran and their concern that the United States was leaving. And if the United States was no longer going to be there to protect them, they had to find other partners to work with. And both the Israelis and our Arab allies began to recognize that there was a commonality of interests, a common fear and hatred of Iran that could be the basis of a new alliance. And so this is something else that we've seen play out. But the truth of the matter is that none of them really knows what they can expect from the other. The Israelis look at the Gulf states, the Arab states, and they say, well, in some ways it's very helpful to us. It certainly helps us with the Palestinians to have these countries on our side. They're closer to Iran. That gives the Iranians some pause. They have ties with various groups, Muslim groups, Arab groups, other groups inside Iran. That's certainly useful to us. But the question that the Israelis are asking themselves is, if the Iranians attack Saudi Arabia or the Emirates or Bahrain, does Israel want to involve itself in a war with Iran on behalf of one of these countries? Especially because the Iranians have thousands of ballistic missiles that could hit Israel. And of course, Iran is allied with Hezbollah, which has somewhere above 150,000 rockets and missiles that can hit Israel. And so the Israelis are asking themselves, on the one hand, it's great to have these Arab allies. On the other hand, if they get into a fight with the Iranians, do we want to get involved and jeopardize our own security, our own people, and risk retaliation against Israel? And by the same token, the Arabs themselves are asking the same question. They look at the Israelis and they say the Israelis are very trigger happy, something that on some days they like, because they always feel like the United States is too reticent to use force. So they like the fact that the Israelis are very willing to use force, and they like the fact that the Israelis have a very capable military. But they worry that the Israelis will pick a fight with the Iranians, and the Iranians will choose not to retaliate against Israel, but to retaliate against Israel's new allies in the Gulf, right? It's much easier for the Iranians to hit Saudi Arabia than it is Israel. And the threat of retaliation from Saudi Arabia is much, much less than it is from Israel. And so both sides are, on the one hand, drawn together by this common set of interests, these common threats, but they're wondering just how much they really can get from this kind of a relationship, how much it actually will benefit them. Something else that they're all trying to do is they are trying to figure out how much they can get from the United States. They understand the US is stepping back, but we're not gone, right? And our interest in the region's oil and its hydrocarbons, and by the way, something glad to talk more about in the Q&A, our interest in Middle Eastern oil is not going away, not anytime soon. Might diminish a little bit over time, already has diminished a little bit over time, but it is absolutely not going away. It remains critical to our economy for all kinds of different reasons. And again, the Gulf states recognize that, they know that. And so they say to themselves, all right, well, the Americans are pulling back, but they're not leaving altogether. What can we still get from them? Are there things? And they're trying to figure out in their own head, how do they convince us to do it? Right? So they do all kinds of different things. Sometimes they do good things. You may have been aware the Saudis have just signed one of the largest aviation deals in history to buy an enormous number of 787s from Boeing. Right? Trust me, they could have gotten Airbuses even cheaper because the Europeans would have been glad to subsidize them and pay kickbacks, which Boeing cannot do. They do that as a gift to the American taxpayer. Right? This is a way of creating jobs in the United States, something that they have been doing for 80 years, and they do it very, very deliberately. They also, though, are trying to threaten us a little bit, right? Trying to show us that they have other options. And so these new relationships with China that they're trying to develop are in part a way of saying to the United States, hey, if you guys won't take care of us, if you won't help us, we've got other alternatives. We'll go to the Chinese, your mortal enemy. Right? And that's something that the United States is also thinking about, because something else that's out there on the US side that you need to hold in mind is that, interestingly, even as the US has disengaged from the Middle East under these last three administrations, even as you've had these last three administrations say, the Middle East isn't as important as it has been in the past, and we shouldn't have as much of a role in the Middle East, shouldn't be spending as much of our money, our treasure, blood, capital, et cetera, in the Middle East. People have also been recognizing that one of the greatest sources of leverage that the United States potentially has over China is in the Middle East. China gets its oil from the Persian Gulf overwhelmingly, and China does not have a military presence in the Persian Gulf. The United States does. And so you have a lot of people in Washington who are talking about the best way to deter China from attacking Taiwan is to threaten their oil links with the Persian Gulf in the event of a war. You attack you attack Taiwan, we shut down the oil coming out of the Persian Gulf, right? It's an interesting idea. As I said, it is a very big idea in Washington. Lots of people are talking about it. And trust me when I say that if people in Washington are talking about this idea, people in Beijing are talking about this idea, right? They have heard it, they know it, they are very concerned about it, right? Which brings me to the next critical issue related to all this, which is China's entry onto the scene, right? One of the other things that our allies have been doing as they contemplate our disengagement from the region has been to ask themselves, okay, if the Americans are disengaging, is there some other external great power that we could bring in and have them take the place of the United States? And the obvious country there is China. China needs their oil just like the United States needs their oil, right? That makes them very different from the Russians, who are competitors, another oil producer. China is clearly very interested in the Middle East. China doesn't care about their domestic politics, which they kind of like, but there are downsides as well with China. China is very transactional, and the states of the region don't like that. They like the fact that the United States has recognized that there are long-term relationships that have tremendous value and that need to be nurtured. The Chinese are not there yet. But nonetheless, you have lots of Middle Easterners asking this question of, okay, if the Americans are disengaging, can we get the Chinese to engage? Can we get the Chinese to play the role that the Americans cannot? And so you've seen the Middle East actively courting the Chinese. And as a part of this is just to stick it to us, right? Part of it is just a way of kind of, creating a little leverage with us, saying to us, hey, Americans, you're talking about this strategic competition with China. Well, if you guys aren't here to protect us, we're going to get the Chinese here to protect us. How are you going to like that, right? How does that work out in terms of your global balance of power with China, right? And they're hoping that that will get us to pay more attention to the Middle East. But if that doesn't work out, they are genuinely exploring this question of, okay, what can we get from the Chinese? And one of the biggest problems they have right now is that China doesn't have the military power to enforce its will in the region. It can't project power the way that the United States can. But they all know that China is building a massive military. It is building a blue water navy. The Chinese have 2 aircraft carriers. They're building 2 more. I am absolutely convinced those aircraft carriers are for the Persian Gulf, because having an aircraft carrier in the South China Sea in a major war over Taiwan is a dumb idea. Those carriers will not last 30 seconds in the South China Sea. But in the Persian Gulf, they are wonderful. They are invaluable ways of projecting power. And again, I see this as China recognizing exactly that debate in Washington I just mentioned to you a few minutes ago, which is they know that the Americans are thinking about cutting off their oil from the Persian Gulf in case of a war. They want to be in a position to stop that, right? Which again is bringing them more into the region. Now, to pick up the China thread in all of this, and then I'm going to finish off with the Iranians. To pick up with the China thread in all of this, the Chinese understand exactly what I've said so far. They know that most of their oil comes from the Persian Gulf. And what's more, they have other economic interests in the Persian Gulf. The Persian Gulf, the oil producing states have a phenomenal amount of money. The Chinese are interested in that money. There's a lot going on between places like Dubai and Abu Dhabi and Doha and Beijing. There's a lot of growth potential there. You see lots of economic opportunities. But again, at the end of the day, the most important issue are the hydrocarbons, the oil and the gas. And the Chinese are very interested in being present in the Middle East to make sure that they can always get access to those hydrocarbons. And the negative piece I've already explained to you, which is the potential for some kind of a US-China conflict in the region, or the potential for the Chinese to try to displace us in the region, to push the United States out, especially if that's not something that we want to have happen. That can obviously create conflict. But for a moment, it's also worth recognizing that there's a beneficial aspect to that as well, which is, as I said, the Chinese ultimately have the same interests that we do in the Persian Gulf. They want to see the region's oil flow. They want to see it flow freely. They want to see it flow cheaply, right? That's exactly what we want too. And so you can look at this new agreement that was signed between Saudi Arabia and Iran and brokered by the Chinese as kind of the positive aspect of that, right? Lots of people have focused on the negative. This is China getting involved in the Middle East, right? A part of the world that we've effectively owned for the past 40 or 70 years. And here come the Chinese usurping our role. The Biden administration has reacted, I would actually say, in a fairly mature fashion, saying, look, what the Chinese are doing is in everybody's best interests. They are trying to broker peace between the Saudis and the Iranians, right? That's something that we've all wanted for a very long time. That's an old conflict, but it's one that is heated up dramatically as a result of that American disengagement, right? As we've pulled back, it has frightened the Saudis. It has emboldened the Iranians. They've gone on the attack. That has caused the Saudis to try to fight back. And that's why we've got all of these conflicts all across the Middle East, in Yemen, in Iraq, in Syria, fed by the Iranians on one side and the Saudis on the other. And what the US is saying is, hey, if the Chinese can broker that deal, so much the better. Everybody benefits from that. Now, I will say to you, I think that is an absolutely true statement. And if the Chinese, if this deal that was brokered in Beijing can hold, this would be a wonderful thing. But it's the Middle East, so there are always lots of big buts involved. It's not at all clear whether the Iranians mean it. It's not clear how much the Saudis mean it. The Iranians are in a very difficult situation. They've had these massive protests. Their economy is really hurting. There are succession issues out there. It does seem very clear that the Iranians would really like to kind of bring down the kind of boil in the region to just a simmer. And having a better relationship with the Saudis, just kind of cooling things across the board, I think would be very beneficial to the Iranians for now. I don't think that Iran has given up its long-term goals. I don't think it has given up its overarching foreign policy, which is to dominate the region. And Iran is seeking to overturn all of the other regional governments and establish pro-Iranian governments in all of these different places. I don't think that that has changed. I think that remains their long-term goal. It's just in the short term, they need a little calm. Same thing on the Saudi side, right? They've been getting hammered by these attacks by Iran and its proxies. Most people aren't aware of them. That's why you invite somebody like me to come talk to you. But for the last basically 7 years, the Saudis have been getting hit on a weekly basis by ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones launched by Iran and its allies, primarily the Houthis in Yemen, but sometimes from their Iraqi allies, sometimes from Syrian allies, sometimes directly from Iran itself. And this is horrible for Saudi Arabia, right? This is no way to live your life. Again, Mohammed bin Salman, he has a very ambitious domestic agenda. He truly is trying to transform the Saudi economy and Saudi society. He's trying to do it to prevent any transformation of Saudi politics, which is obviously a different story. But he has finally realized he really does need some peace and quiet to deal with that. And the truth is, he doesn't have the military capacity to push back on the Iranians. He can't strike the Iranians. He literally doesn't have the military to do so. So he needs quiet while he can deal with his domestic situation, and he hopes build up his military to a point where he can deal with the Iranians. All of which suggests that this new agreement is less peace in our time and more like a temporary truce that will last some period of time. And of course, the more that the Chinese can be brought in to make it their responsibility, and they're a little on the hook, let's recognize that. This is a big diplomatic achievement for them. If 6 months from now, the Saudis and Iranians start fighting again, that would really be egg on their faces. And so we can hope that the Chinese will invest some in trying to dampen this conflict now and in the future. And worth noting again that they have relations with both the Saudis and the Iranians. We don't. We only have a relationship with the Saudis. And right now that relationship is quite strained, which is why ultimately, all of this, at least in the near and medium terms for me, does come back to Iran. Right? That is where I'd like to end things by saying that, Iran is just an incredibly difficult country in this part of the world. It's worth remembering that every American administration since Carter, and with the sole exception of Bush 43, of George W. Bush, every single American administration has tried to reach out to the Iranians, has tried to have a rapprochement with the Iranians. And every single time, it has been the Iranians who have said no. And they have said no because they like having the United States as their enemy. And Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader, famously once told their reformist president, Mohammad Khatami, I can't give up the American enemy, because if I do, then there is no justification for my rule. Right? Very important statement to understand. So Iran defines us as their enemy. They don't seem to have any inclination to give us up. And yet it is an increasingly embattled state. And so as we think about the Middle East, right, and we can talk about the Israelis, I'm following them minute to minute here, and they're obviously important players as well, talk about them in the Q&A. But just as you think about the international relations of the Middle East, right, it's all of these different complicated pieces. The US trying to disengage, but not being able to, because our interests ultimately are still too tied to the region. The security vacuum that has created, the way that that has frightened Israel and Saudi Arabia and the UAE and all of our allies, in part because it has emboldened the Iranians and allowed them to pursue their dreams and made all of these different gains. And meantime, the Chinese coming in, hoping to make economic gains, hoping to be able to preserve their access to oil, slowly willing to engage more with the politics of the region, but ultimately hoping to remain free riders and let the US take the bulk of it. Right? It's this incredibly complicated set of circumstances in the Middle East, which are producing all of these very unpredictable events, both attacks and treaties that nobody could have predicted even days beforehand. And for better or worse, I suspect that we're going to see a lot more of that in the days to come.
Thank you, Ken. That was a terrific update. Let me ask the first question, if I could. Give us an updated focus, if you would, on what is going on in Iran. Now, we all know that the sanctions have had some effect, but probably not as great as we would hope. And yet, you look at indications, for example, the rial is now worth, 1/100th of what it was maybe 15 or 20 years ago, et cetera, et cetera. How vulnerable is the regime to just a kind of economic disintegrate? And they're not going to disintegrate, but in fact, there is enough weakness there that you could imagine public protests, aside from the protests that have gone on in recent months, as culminating in some kind of very dramatic event. What's your thought on that?
Yeah, so this is a great question, Tyler, and it's a huge question. And I'll start by saying that, everything that you just said is correct. So on the one hand, there's no question that Iran is really hurting. And look, they've been hurting. They've been hurting at some level since their revolution. They never got the economy right. They never got their social system right. They never got their political system right. That's been a source of constant trouble, but it's obviously been getting worse and worse and worse over the last 20 years. And, we're starting to see almost perpetual unrest in Iran, almost perpetual protests of one kind or another. And obviously the most recent ones, the Mahsa Amini protests, as they're being referred to, very big, very meaningful, but there's always big buts in the Middle East. One of the very few things that we know about revolutions, and let's understand, these are all would-be revolutions, right? These are all the Iranian people wanting to overthrow their government. But one of the very few things that we know from history is that revolutions only succeed when the regime loses either the will or the capacity to use force. And unfortunately, we've not seen any diminution of either. Right? This most recent round, again, the regime united together, stood together, and was able to use force very effectively. so effectively that they never really had to kind of call on their most powerful regime protection forces. It was mostly handled by what we call their law enforcement forces, to some extent the besieged. They never got to the Revolutionary Guards themselves. They never had to call in the Revolutionary Guards to save the regime, which again speaks to a tremendous amount of resilience in terms of the regime's ability and willingness to simply use force to crush people. And so both halves of what you said are absolutely true. And what it increasingly suggests is an Iran that's kind of headed, the destination that is coming to mind is North Korea with oil. Right? And let's recognize that the oil piece is a very important one. Unlike the North Koreans, remember, years ago, the North Koreans, something like 7 million people starved to death. Maybe I have the number wrong, but it was at least a million, several million people starved to death because of the sanctions on them and the mismanagement of their economy. Right? The Iranians probably will never get to that point because they will always have oil. Right? And worth noting, right now, the oil market is pretty constricted, right? That's why we've got prices up between $70 and $90 a barrel. And it's been floating around there. And the Saudis have been saying to people, if the Chinese really do reopen, right? If the end of zero COVID means a sudden increase in Chinese economic activity, the Saudis are saying, we don't have the capacity to provide that level of oil. It's going to have to come from somewhere. And when you look around the world, the only spare oil capacity out there, it's really in three places: Russia, Venezuela, and Iran. Right? All three countries that are under our sanctions, all three countries that we don't want to see any more oil. And even if we say, all right, we'll let the Venezuelans sell, but not the Russians and China and Iranians, it still means that Iranian oil will be worth more on the black market. And there will be countries like China who will be willing to bust the sanctions. And so the Iranian regime will probably always have some access to resources that seems likely to enable them to keep control over the country. But as you pointed out at the end, and again, this is exactly the right place to end your question, unless something unforeseen happens. Right? And we should always remember, it's the Middle East. Something unforeseen always happens. Right? That is the whole history of the Middle East. Yeah. But of course, it's unforeseen. We don't know what it's going to be. The best guess I think most people have is that Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, will die, and probably sooner rather than later. And there may well be some kind of a succession crisis. But that's about the best we can do in terms of peering into our crystal ball and foreseeing something that might cause a radical change in Iran's trajectory.
Well, I've got you on succession possibilities. There was an article in The Economist the other day that indicated that actually the most logical and workable succession to Khamenei might be the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard, because in effect they control about half the economy, and apparently they're a little more liberal and a little more not pro-capitalist, but willing to engage in relations with other countries. It's theoretically, were they to come into power. I'm just curious briefly, what's your thought on succession? I mean, there are other possibilities too.
Yeah, there are lots, but what I agree with there, and again, I think a lot of us have been thinking about this in this ways for the last 15 or 20 years. I think that the Guard is going to come out the winner in any succession to Khamenei, because they are so powerful, exactly as you described it. They have an enormous amount of control over the Iranian economy. Obviously, they are the preeminent Iranian security force, both internally and increasingly externally as well. And as a result of all those things, they have a tremendous amount of political power. So when you take their economic power, their military role, and their political power, they are increasingly dominating this government. And in some ways, some friends of mine, other Iran analysts, have made this argument that, in some ways, Khamenei is the kind of the last, firebreak from their complete control. And when he dies, it's highly likely that whoever takes over is going to be even more beholden to the Revolutionary Guard. So you won't necessarily see kind of the commander of the Revolutionary Guard as supreme leader, but you are likely to see a supreme leader who is entirely beholden to the Revolutionary Guard. And as a result, the state will be more run by the Revolutionary Guard. And as you point out, I would put it this way, the Guard tends to be somewhat more pragmatic because they deal in both hard power and hard cash. And that's what they're interested in, hard power and hard cash. Now that said, don't assume for a minute that that's better for us or our allies, right? They hate us, they define us as their enemy. Again, they want that enemy. They hate Israel. They want to destroy the state of Israel. And at the end of the day, the Guard too wants to be the dominant power in the entire Middle East, right? And they want that both because reasons of prestige and ego, but also as far as they're concerned, defense. The only way that they can defend Iran is if the entire Middle East consists of friendly governments. So while yes, you can imagine somewhat more pragmatic realpolitik relations between Iran and some other countries if the Guard is more in charge, I wouldn't assume that it's going to be any better for us or the countries we care most about. I suspect it'll be as bad, maybe even worse, because Khamenei, for all of his anti-Americanism, has been extremely cautious and extremely prudent when taking us on. And some of the Revolutionary Guard commanders tend to be real hotheads. So that's what I feel about that trajectory.
Okay, thank you. I'm sure we've got some questions from other folks on the panel. Don, perhaps, or others?
Yes, it's Don Shields. I'm curious about the relation. You haven't really mentioned and talked too much about Russia, and Russia is kind of chipping away at the sides here with its intervention in Syria, for example. And I wondered what about that little periphery around this Middle East, Syria, Russia?
Yeah, it's a great question, Don. I'm glad you asked it. And in particular, if we were having this talk, 13, 14 months ago, I would have put Russia into that same category as China, because at the time, the Middle Eastern states were asking the question, well, okay, the Americans are leaving. We're not sure what we can get from the Chinese. Maybe Russia is yet another alternative. And as you point out, they saw Russia's interventions in both Syria and Libya as being exactly the kind of thing that they like, right? In both Syria and Libya, the Russians came in, they came in very big on behalf of the resident autocrat, right? And they saw it as, Russia supports its friends. That's exactly the way that Putin was pitching it, was you can't count on the Americans. The Americans threw Hosni Mubarak under the bus, right? Whereas we will back our allies to the hilt, right? And for a while, that was something that, again, the Middle Eastern states were very intrigued by. Since the war in Ukraine, that has just flipped, right? And they recognize that the Russians just aren't strong enough, that Syria was kind of a one-off in a certain set of circumstances. They feel like Russia is now deeply bogged down in Ukraine and isn't going to have the wherewithal to help them. And what's more, they also look at Russian military equipment as being garbage, right? And they kind of knew that all along, right? They always, because many of these countries had bought Russian equipment, and they could pretty quickly tell, yeah, this stuff is not as good as the stuff we get from the Americans or the Europeans, et cetera. But they had geopolitical reasons, and in some cases the Russians would sell it cheap, so they were willing to buy it. But again, after what's happened in Ukraine, they're all saying, the Russian stuff is junk. We really want the American and European stuff. If we can't get that, the Chinese stuff is the next best item, right? And again, they're all looking at China as a country whose arms industry is getting better and better and better, whose military is getting more able to project power. They look at the Russians as moving in the opposite direction. So it's been one of the benefits of the Ukraine war, if you want to put it that way.
Yeah. Could I ask you a second question, which is the United Nations completely passé and has no role whatsoever in all this going on?
Pretty much. Let's recognize the United Nations has never been more than the sum of its parts, right? It just hasn't. Franklin Roosevelt, Eleanor Roosevelt had this lovely vision for this institution. It's never been able to live up to it. And when you think about those moments in time when it really was able to play a role, it's mostly been because the United States really backed it to the hilt and had the freedom to do so. Right? The heyday of the United Nations was the 1990s and early 2000s, because we had won the Cold War, right? We saw value in the United Nations. We wanted the United Nations to do lots of things around the world, either instead of us or as kind of the umbrella organization for us to build a coalition. And during that 20-year period, the United Nations was wonderfully useful. But again, it was wonderfully useful because we were providing, the real guns and money behind it. And the Russians weren't vetoing everything, and the Chinese weren't vetoing everything. And even our European allies were more or less cooperating. And so, we had this little bit of a golden age in there. In the Middle East today, it's not that the UN is irrelevant, but again, the UN mostly plays, it plays this role of kind of a more palatable version of the US. So there's a bunch of stuff that the UN does, for example, in places like Lebanon and Iraq, right? And it's really the US and our European allies, but we do it through or under the cover of the United Nations because the Iranians and their allies don't like the US doing it openly. So we do it under cover of the United Nations, which, that's not nothing. And we should try to take advantage of it as much as we can. But ultimately, we need to recognize that the United Nations is not at a point, and may never be at a point, where it has independent capacity, independent power and freedom of maneuver, absent the United States or some other great power who wants to vest it with the power that we always hoped it would have.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Ken. And I'll let someone else.
Joyce.
You're muted,
Yeah.
June.
So I have some questions from our audience who are listening intently. One is from our colleague, Peter Russell. And he asks, can you speak about the challenges facing Jordan?
Oh boy, are we going to order in for pizza for this one?
Absolutely. It'll be fun.
Yeah, Peter, this is a great question. I'm going to be brief, if only because you can either give a brief answer or an incredibly long answer. Jordan is a country that I think, we've all been worried about for, 100 years, and I think rightly so. And, you can look out there on the horizon and say there are definitely good signs. Again, I give the Biden administration a lot of credit. They just, approved a very big increase in the aid package to Jordan. They need that. There's the prospect of doing these desalination plants with the Israelis. That would be huge because God knows Jordan desperately needs water. But, Jordan is just kind of beset on all sides. It's got a decent economy, largely because of the relationship with Israel and its ability to bring in European and American dollars and then export goods around the region. Politically, it's got all kinds of problems. The monarchy has not been doing a great job in terms of solidifying its support among the populace. It is surrounded by, all kinds of problem countries, Syria, and Iraq, potentially in Saudi Arabia at some point in time, if Mohammed bin Salman's reforms don't go well. Indians on another side who are having their own difficulties right now. I very much worry about Jordan. And I will simply end on the note of saying that one of the things that's most worrying to me for Jordan is that as the Iranians consolidate their control over Syria and deepen their influence in Iraq, and they're not as powerful, quite, I would say, in Iraq as they are in Syria, but nonetheless, their influence continues to slowly grow in Iraq. The next obvious country for them to set their sights on is Jordan. And I've had this conversation with various Israeli military and security officials. They have the same concern. Because of Jordan's political problems, economic problems, and the huge Palestinian population there, where Iran has lots of contacts because of its support for Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad and the PFL-PGC and all of these other groups, right? Jordan is an obvious candidate for the Iranians to go after next in their usual way, right? Subversion, build ties to the community, find terrorist groups and other oppositionists, and try to start pitting them against the government. I said, I'm nervous about this. I know the Israelis are nervous about this. It is Iran's obvious next target. And I hope that the United States and our allies in the region continue to pay attention to Jordan, because boy, if that went the way of Lebanon and Syria and even Iraq, that would just be disastrous.
And they have a 50% unemployment rate because 25% is Palestinian refugees. What
Yep.
about nuclear?
Which aspect of nuclear, Naomi?
Anyone you choose.
All right,
There's
so let's
so
start.
many.
Let's start with the Iranians, if only because it's the place to start, and I think it's actually the easiest one. So obviously, the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, is basically, I don't know if it's dead, but it's certainly in a coma, maybe a medically induced coma, but it's in a coma at the moment, and it's not at all clear when it's going to get revived. That said, what's been interesting is that everybody has more or less just kind of decided to leave it lying, right? And not to really do anything big with it, which is both interesting and I think very, very important. If the Iranians had reacted by suddenly greatly ramping up their nuclear program, which is what they've done in the past, right? That would set everybody on edge. And instead, what we've seen is that the Iranians are, they're always doing something, but they're doing it at very, very low levels. It's very small. And in fact, to me, what was most noteworthy was that when the IAEA announced that the Iranians had enriched beyond 60% purity to 84%, the Iranians immediately stepped in and said, no, we haven't, right? Go and check. There might be some, isotopes, there might be some, molecule or whatever, atoms that are above it, but the whole sample is still at 60%, right? And that's all we're enriching to. And in the past, of course, when they've wanted to, use this as leverage, they boast about it. Hey, we're enriching to 60% today. What are you guys going to do about it, right? You better make us a deal if you want us to stop. Now they're doing the exact opposite, right? Which says to me that they really aren't doing a whole lot there. They don't want to provoke anyone. And here I actually give some credit to both the Biden administration and the Israeli government, both Netanyahu and before that, Lapid, because together, they came up with what, at least for the moment, seems to be a viable alternative with the Iranian nuclear program, whereby they both said the deal is basically dead because the Iranians will not accept the existing terms. If the Iranians start making significant progress, we will attack you, right? And it's been both the Americans and the Israelis. And some of you are probably aware, you've probably seen it in the newspapers, that we've been doing very, very ostentatiously, we've been doing these military exercises with the Israelis, right? And what's important about them is we do these kind of exercises with the Israelis all the time, right? The last one was called Juniper Oak, right? Juniper Oak is not a meaningful code name, right? It's a code name that means this is an ongoing series of exercises. Nobody had ever covered this before. The news media didn't care about it, right? Because it was just a non-exercise. We and the Israelis decided to make a big deal of it, right? We committed nuclear capable aircraft to it. We committed F-35s, right? We made a big deal about saying this is practice for a joint American-Israeli airstrike on the Iranian nuclear program, right? That was very, very different. And it was the Biden administration sending the signal to the Iranians, this is going to be our answer, right? You don't want to do the JCPOA, fine. That's not our preference, but we can live with the status quo as long as you guys do not start making more progress on your nuclear program. And if you do, our answer is not going to be more sanctions. Our answer is going to be a military strike, right? And I think that so far that has worked with the Iranians, and I stress so far, but I think it has. I will also say I think that it has been very helpful with the Israelis. And again, I give the Biden administration credit. They understand this. They understand that if the Iranian nuclear program is just allowed to kind of go on and do its own thing, that makes the Israelis, and by the way, the Saudis, the Emiratis, all of our regional allies unbelievably nervous. And so having these exercises with the Israelis and making these much more forceful deterrent declarations is a great way to kind of keep the Israelis in lockstep with us and make sure they don't go off the reservation and go off half-cocked. So it's all a long-winded way of saying that right now, I actually think that the nuclear issue is on the back burner, right? And as always, I can't see what might push it to the front burner, let alone cause it to boil over. But again, it's the Middle East. And it's one of these things where on the one hand, I look at it and say, everything looks pretty good there, right? Given where we are, this is not a bad equilibrium point. And as long as we can stick with this, it's all fine, right? And again, I think the Iranians do have their own issues that they're trying to sort out. That's why. But this is one of these where this is not a long-term answer to this problem, right? I think at some point in time, we're going to have to go back to a long-term answer. And I do think that as flawed as the JCPOA was, it's still the best answer, right? Getting back to it, getting a deal in place is absolutely the best answer. Because trying to go to war with the Iranians over their nuclear program, in the end, I think is going to result in an Iranian nuclear weapon, right? I think that is the surest way to an Iranian nuclear weapon is to try attacking them, right? Even no matter how much damage we and the Israelis may do to them in the short term, they will rebuild, they will dig deeper into bigger mountains, right? And at some point they will have a nuclear weapon.
So
Ken, we have
another,
a question from the audience about the long ingrained Shia-Sunni divide. Do you think that that is still kind of a reason to be concerned about whether, in fact, for example, the new rapprochement will eventually kind of peter out or not quite work? What does this religious conflict say to you about where the Middle East is headed? Maybe it's much less of a factor than it would have been 10 or 20 years ago.
Yeah, so I will say that the Sunni Shia conflict is a real thing and it's out there and it's gotten so much worse in the last 20 or 30 years, right? Always important. And I think I said this back in 2014 with your group, but I'll say it again because it bears repeating. We should always remember to never make the same mistake. Westerners, we tend to equate the Sunni Shia divide with the Catholic Protestant divide, right? It's a very different history. They don't have the same history of bloodshed at all. There are no wars of the Reformation, no 30 Years' War, no Spanish Inquisition. It's gotten worse in the last 20, 30 years as a result of a variety of different factors that I'm not going to go into, but it's there. It's not unimportant, but the bigger issue really was the Saudi-Iranian split, right? And let's always remember, the Iranians didn't want to make this about the Sunni Shia issue, right? It's the Saudis who did. And it's understandable because the Saudis, there are 30 million Saudis, there are 84 million Iranians. And, let's be honest, the Iranians have tended to be a lot more resourceful and capable and hardworking than the Saudis, right? So if you're the Saudis fighting 30 million against 84 million Iranians, probably not a good bet. But if you make it Sunni Shia, now all of a sudden you've got 1.2 billion Sunnis in the world, right? Against about 200 million Shia in the world. So a much better way for the Saudis to build a wider coalition against Iran. And again, it's not that this is totally cynical on their part. Part of the reason that the Saudis do hate the Iranians is because they are Shia, right? But again, so much of it is about these two big regional governments. And let's also recognize for them, it's just as much, if not more, about Persian Arab as it is Sunni Shia, right? I mean, the truth is, when you speak to Arabs about the Iranians, they go crazy, right? They hate the Persians. And, they will just, spit curses at them. Always worth remembering, all through the Iran-Iraq war, Iraq, which is a majority Shia country, The Iraqi Shia fought like mad for Saddam against the Ayatollah, against the Iranians, right? Because for them, being Arab was far more important than being Shia, right? So at the end of the day, it's more Persian Arab and it's more Saudi Iran than anything. And so as a result, where do I think it's going in the future? I think it's mostly about the future of the Saudi-Iranian relationship. And, as I suggested to you, I see, this deal worked out by the Chinese as being something pretty tactical, something that both the Saudis and the Iranians would like right now for their own reasons. I don't know how far it's going to go. I don't know how long it's going to last. I don't think it will by itself solve the problem. I think that there are going to be a lot of other things that are going to have to happen that will solve the problem. First and foremost among them, I think the Iranians are going to have to accept a very different kind of foreign policy, right? They have to stop trying to dominate the Arab world, which is what they're trying to do. If they're not willing to do that, then this will flare up again between the Iranians and the Saudis will once again make it a Sunni Shia thing. If, somehow we get the Iranians to realize that they need to stop trying to dominate the Arab world, trying to stop, undermine or attack these Arab governments, anything's possible. As I said, I think it kind of unlikely. The Iranians have, I'll go back to the very first question you raised, Tyler. The Iranians have stuck with this foreign policy despite all kinds of horrible hardships inflicted on their country. Wars, sanctions, you name it, and they've stuck with this foreign policy. That suggests to me that it's pretty deeply ingrained, and again, especially if it's the Revolutionary Guard that winds up in further control after Khamenei, I don't see them doing that.
So another question from our audience is, can you expand on the U.S. long-term interest in the Middle Eastern on hydrocarbons?
Sure. Let me see if I can do this quickly because it is big. So point number one is that hydrocarbons are going to remain a part of everyone's economy, including our own, for a long time to come, if only because Dan Yergin made this point in his brand new book. Even if somehow we got rid of all of the oil that is used in heating and in transportation, let's remember that plastics are all made of hydrocarbons, right? Yergin makes a wonderful point. Everybody is, the Tesla, how wonderful the Tesla is. Isn't it fantastic, right? It doesn't require fuel to be driven. And as Dan points out, okay, yeah, it's all great, but the Tesla is made of oil, right? The whole car is basically plastics, which are all oil, right? And so the demand for oil may change, and that may soften things if there's no longer the same demand for oil for energy and for heating as there once was. But oil is going to remain a critical commodity long into the future because it's got so many different uses. Second point to understand, it's not about where we get our oil from, right? This is the most important point that I need to reinforce to every audience. Everyone thinks that because of the shale revolution and because we are producing about as much oil as we consume, and understand that it varies from year to year, that somehow this makes us immune from the importance of oil. It doesn't. Oil is a global market. It is a global commodity. If we lose 10 million barrels per day from Saudi Arabia, the whole world loses them, right? And the only way that we could withstand that would be to shut down our borders, right? To say to the oil companies, you are not allowed to export a barrel of oil. Now that in and of itself would be problematic because right now, we still export as much as we import, right? Just because whatever is cheapest, what is most economically efficient, right? You produce a barrel of oil in the Gulf Coast, right? Down in Texas or something like that. It may be cheaper and make more profit for Exxon to export that barrel of oil to Europe than it is to send that barrel of oil to Chicago, right? Chicago, it might be better to get their oil from North Dakota, from the shale fields. It's sometimes cheaper for New York and Boston to get their oil from Europe or from the Persian Gulf, right? It's all about these changing prices of oil. So first point is you shut down all of our borders, you shut down all of our oil, you say we're not allowed to export. That in and of itself drives up the price of oil. Second thing is we need to recognize it's all the world's oil. If we keep all of our oil for ourselves, but the rest of the world has lost 10 million barrels of Saudi production, all of their economies tank, right? All of their economies will go into massive recession. And last time I checked, 37% of US GDP is based on trade. So if all of our trade partners' economies tank because of a massive oil crisis, our economy will tank because their economies are tanking, right? So there's this indirect effect from the price. So at the end of the day, it's not at all about where we get our oil from or how much oil we produce. The question is, how much oil is there in the world? What is the price? And what is the ability to replace massive shortfalls in oil? And the problem with the Middle East is it simultaneously produces a tremendous amount of oil, and it is vulnerable to massive oil disruptions. That's what makes the Middle East and its hydrocarbons so important to the world. And I'll just add a last point, which is, as Europe figures out that they can't be dependent on Russian gas, the alternatives are increasingly about the Middle East, right? That is the obvious place for them to get replacement gas from. And that's great. Economically, it makes perfect sense, but that once again focuses the world on the Middle East and its hydrocarbons. And again, you can say, well, it's not our gas, sure, but we have a massive amount of trade with Europe. And if the European economies experience a massive recession, right, that means they're not buying our stuff. That means that their exports to us go up, right? And our economy suffers just as much. It'll just take a few months longer.
And could I ask you a question about leaping ahead into the future? If suddenly tomorrow or the next day, Iran became a lovely member of the Middle East and friendly and warm and cuddly as it sometimes was before, would there still be problems in the Middle East?
So, Don, first, if you've got any thoughts on how we can get to that future, I'm all ears, because I would love to have that set of problems, right? And look, at the end of the day, you are correct that there will still be problems in the Middle East. No question about it. The simple fact of the matter is that, and I think this is what I talked about back in 2014, the Arab state system that emerged after the Second World War is broken. Right? It's just broken. It was never great, right? It's not like anyone wanted to be Nasser's Egypt, but it's gotten much, much worse. Because of globalization, because of the massive demographic changes in the Middle East, right? You've had this explosion of population that's just kind of swamped their kind of dilapidated, antiquated systems, right? And they all kind of get this. Talking about Jordan before, and Jordan's another perfect example of this. As Naomi was pointed out, we've got these massive problems in Jordan, as we do in so many countries, of unemployment, youth unemployment, underemployment, right? Because they just can't generate jobs. They just can't generate human capital who can work in a globalized economy, right? All of this stuff is out there, and it would be out there even if, as you point out, Don, even if the Iranians were angels, these problems would still exist, and they would still be very dangerous, right? Always worth noting that the biggest problems in terms of shortfalls of Middle East oil production have been caused by internal conflict, civil war, revolution, that kind of stuff, right? That's what caused the biggest collapses in Middle Eastern oil production. The Iranian Revolution, the Iraqi Civil War, the Libyan Civil War, things like that. But of course, the Iranians make everything worse. They make everything much worse. They love civil wars, they love insurgencies, they love terrorist groups. Wherever they find them, they stoke them, right? They make them worse because the Iranians are hoping to bring down these governments and cause chaos. That works for their advantage, right? So they're always in there trying to make everything worse. But yeah, the problems would exist. And from my perspective, you can't try to solve without one without the other. In fact, years ago, Steve Hadley and Madeleine Albright ran a big task force on the Middle East that the Atlantic Council led. And they asked me to head their security working group, which is a fascinating exercise. And the report that we ultimately wrote, which by the way is available on the web, the report that we wrote and that Madeline and Steve loved and made the centerpiece of their big task force report was we said, look, there's a deal to be struck here because all of our allies want help with Iran, right? They're all terrified of the Iranians. And some of them even, recognize that they have to do these domestic reforms, but they don't feel like they can because they're afraid that the moment they start to open things up, the Iranians are going to jump right in and tear it all apart and turn it into a revolution. And so what we said was, look, the obvious deal here is we deal with the Iranians. We will push back on the Iranians. We will keep them out of your internal affairs, which is something we can actually do. But in return, you've got to deal with your internal affairs. You've got to reform. And as long as you're reforming, we'll deal with the Iranians. You stop reforming, we'll stop dealing with the Iranians, right? And as I said, to me, it's an obvious deal. Steve and Madeline loved it. I think the deal is still out there. It's just nobody wants to do it, right? Everyone wants to have their cake and eat it too. We want all of our allies to reform, and we want to not have to either deal with the Iranians or deal with them.
Having read 1919 and how these countries were all divided up way back then, that's 100 years ago now, it's just amazing how these dregs still are there, and these countries,
Oh, yeah.
these borders and the countries. It's just amazing to me.
Ken, refocusing on Saudi Arabia a little bit, what is your take on the Saudi effort to kind of do a deal with the U.S. whereby they would recognize Israel, and in answer to that, we would give them or proclaim that they are a valued ally. We would give them security guarantees, and we would enhance our shipments of high-grade weaponry and aircraft and so forth. Does that make any sense? I mean, sure it does from the Saudi standpoint, but that is something that I gather the U.S. Congress would be very unlikely to approve.
Sure, exactly. Let me take each piece of that in turn, Tyler. I mean, from my perspective, I will tell you, I actually think that it is something that's perfectly worth doing. I think the truth of the matter is, again, before Trump and Obama, that was U.S. policy. That's what the Carter Doctrine said. And, I think Joe Biden actually does believe that. And he's actually put his money a little bit where his mouth was. Again, you folks probably don't remember this, but that's why you invite people like me. Back in November, there were a bunch of newspaper stories where the United States government was coming out and saying, we have credible evidence that the Iranians are about to attack Saudi Arabia, about to attack Saudi oil facilities, and we're going to prevent that. And we dispatched extra fighter aircraft to the region, and we took a number of other steps to heighten our own readiness and to show the Iranians that if you think you're going to attack Saudi oil, you're going to have to come through us, right? We flew aircraft up and down the Iranian coast, really getting in their faces. And the Saudis actually for a short while really were very pleased with that. And they saw that as another kind of reminder that the United States hadn't completely walked away from the region, and we were still interested in Saudi security. And I think things like that can be very, very meaningful to the Saudis, right? And I think that the more that the United States can do things like that, it restates that. So bottom line is, I think that has been the commitment that the United States has made. And I'm perfectly comfortable with making it because, again, I think that the hydrocarbon assets of the region are hugely important. And my reading of the history is that the United States has played an enormously stabilizing role in the region, right? And, I think the proof of that is as we have pulled back since 2009, right, the region has not gotten better. It has gotten a lot worse, right? And so my feeling is, if we recommit, and we don't need to do a lot, people seem to think that we've got this massive military presence in the Persian Gulf. We don't, right? We got almost nothing there. We don't keep any carriers there anymore. We've got a few surface ships. We typically have one fighter squadron, maybe two, right? We have no ground troops whatsoever. We just have equipment. that we can fall in on if we need be. It's a very minimal footprint in the region. And frankly, that's all that we need. So on the one hand, I think strategically it makes sense. Politically, as you point out, makes no sense. Nobody's going to go to the Capitol and say to Congress, we think that you guys should sign on to a treaty with the Saudis. It's not clear that the Senate's going to approve a treaty with anyone, except of course Finland and Sweden joining NATO. And even there, I have no doubt that you'll have a few congressmen and senators standing up and saying we should not be doing this. We should not be extending security guarantees to any more countries. Who cares what happens to Finland? Right? But beyond that, just the desire is just not there any longer. And so, yeah, I think politically speaking, it's dead on arrival. And again, let's also recognize that those other aspects of politics that I was talking about in my opening remarks, Joe Biden would have to go to the left wing of the Democratic Party and explain why he is signing a security treaty with, Mohammed bin Salman, the guy who they were, regard as the butcher of Riyadh, right?
Yeah.
It'd be very tough for him to do that as well. So yeah, I think it highly unlikely. I think it's kind of a shame because, and look, the Saudis also share blame in this. It's not all on our fault. I think they're being kind of petulant about the fact that they're not getting this. But from my perspective, I would be willing to make the deal with the Saudis because I think we should be defending the Saudis against the Iranians. And I think that if that results in the Saudis making peace with the Israelis, so much the better, right? From my perspective, that's gravy.
Well, Ken, I bet you've got a lot of other stuff to do today. So, and you have been an absolute font of information and key opinions about a very complicated place. So thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate it. And everyone's applauding. You see that?
Thank you. It was really a pleasure. Always great. I mean,
Okay.
you guys
well,
ask such smart questions. And, for someone like me, that's what I was like. Ask me hard questions.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thanks again. And look, we'll have to do it again in 9 years.
You
So
know what,
20
I would say at the rate things are going, we might need them in 9 months.
9 months. Yeah, right.
Might need him tomorrow.
Yeah.
If there's
I'm
still a
going
Middle
there.
East in 9 years or 9 months or tomorrow, I'm glad to do it again.
Okay.
It was really a
Thanks again, Ken. Terrific.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. I want to remind you that we will be here again in 2 weeks on April 11th with Blake Herzinger.
April 10th.
Oh, April, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I don't type
April
well.
10th.
Sorry, thank you. With Blake Herzinger, who is a non-resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, who specializes in Indo-Pacific defense policy and US security in Asia. So we're gonna sort of switch our geography, but of course China is there and this is their neighbors. So this is their backyard. Taiwan has been in the news, and I think we will be very interested in hearing more about how he views what is going on with China and the United States in terms of Taiwan. So please join us. We look forward to seeing you. And again, Ken, thank you so much.
Okay, and I want to thank the planning committee for all their work, Tyler, especially today. Those questions were great, and putting this all together. And thank you all for coming to the Chappaqua Library's Foreign Policy Discussion Group series. Hope to see you again on April 10th, 10 o'clock. Please go to our website, chappaqua.library.org, to register for the program. Thanks, guys. Bye, everyone.
Bye,
Thanks.
bye.